We believe we understand the shape of history. We see it in clean lines on a map, in the neat arrows of an offensive, in the black and white photographs of men in uniform, their faces stoic and distant. We talk of turning points and grand strategy, of ideologies clashing like tectonic plates. We sanitize the past into a narrative we can comfortably observe, a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that sits safely behind the glass of a screen. But that is a profound and dangerous illusion. The reality is not a clean line, it is a septic wound. It is not a story, it is a scream trapped in the ice. The place we are going today is the epicenter of that reality. It is a name that has become a synonym for apocalypse, Stalingrad. You have heard the name, but you do not know the place. You cannot. Not from a textbook. Not from a documentary that edits the horror into digestible segments. To understand it, you have to feel the cold seep into your bones. You have to hear the silence that comes after the last shot is fired. I am asking you to do something difficult. To set aside the comfort of distance. To truly bear witness, not to the grand spectacle of war, but to the small, intimate, and absolute dissolution of 500,000 lives. Are you willing to look into the abyss? Not for entertainment, but for understanding. To hold in your mind the weight of what happens when ambition, ideology, and hatred are distilled into a single, frozen point on the map. If you are, then the world outside must fall away. The noise of your life must cease. Find a quiet room. Dim the lights. This is not a story to be consumed lightly. It is a vigil. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. The snow does not remember names. It falls with a divine and thoughtless indifference, blanketing the guilty and the innocent alike, covering the iron skeletons of tanks and the soft, discarded shapes of men with the same pristine shroud. Before the snow, however, there was dust. An ocean of it, churned into a golden haze by the iron treads of the Sixth Army as it rolled east across the Ukrainian steppe in the summer of 1942. This was not merely an army, it was an expression of an idea, a physical manifestation of a nation's will. It was the tempered steel tip of Operation Blue, the grand German offensive designed to cripple the Soviet Union by seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus. The men inside the panzers and the half-tracks, the infantry marching under the immense, pale sky, felt themselves to be agents of destiny. They were veterans, many of them, of the swift, intoxicating victories in France and Poland. They moved with a practiced and terrible grace, a mechanized predator gliding through a landscape that seemed to stretch into eternity. The sun baked their necks, the dust coated their throats, but their spirits were high, fueled by the drug of momentum. Every village that fell, every river crossed, every captured column of weary Red Army soldiers reinforced the central, seductive myth of their own invincibility. They were the inheritors of a martial tradition that saw war as a science and victory as a birthright. Their commanders, men like Friedrich Paulus, were meticulous planners, architects of battle who saw the world as a chessboard. And on this board, they were making all the right moves. Stalingrad, the city bearing the name of their arch-nemesis, was at first a secondary objective, a flank to be secured on the way to the real prize, the oil. But names have power. And this name, Stalin's city, began to exert a gravitational pull on the German imagination, and more importantly, on Adolf Hitler's obsession. It transformed from a strategic waypoint into a symbolic crucible. To take this city would be to personally humiliate the Soviet dictator, to tear his name from the map and, with it, the heart from his regime. The Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was diverted, its immense power focused like a lens onto this single point on the Volga River. As they advanced, the steppe grew drier, the resistance stiffer. The air crackled with a new intensity. The soldiers could not have known it, but they were not marching toward a prize. They were marching toward a furnace that had been prepared for them, a place where the laws of conventional warfare, and indeed the laws of physics and biology, would be systematically dismantled. They were a river of steel and men, flowing inexorably toward a drain, unaware that the placid horizon before them concealed a precipice from which there would be no return. The dust of summer was a prelude, a soft curtain rising on a tragedy of truly classical proportions, where the protagonist's greatest strength, his pride and his power, would become the precise instrument of his doom. The city was not a city anymore. By the time the first German storm troops pushed into its western suburbs in mid-September, it was already a skeletal ruin, a jagged silhouette of fire and smoke against the bruised autumn sky. The Luftwaffe had done its work with methodical brutality, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries and high explosives, intending to terrorize the defenders and flatten the landscape for the advancing panzers. But they had not created a clear field of fire, they had created a fortress. They had sown the dragon's teeth of modern warfare, and from the rubble, a new kind of soldier arose. The city had been broken down into its constituent elements, brick, steel, and concrete. It was no longer a place of homes, factories, and boulevards, but a three-dimensional labyrinth of snipers' nests, machine gun emplacements, and ambush points. Every shattered apartment block was a redoubt, every sewer tunnel a hidden artery for reinforcements, every pile of rubble a potential grave. This was the birth of the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, the grand, sweeping maneuvers of the open steppe vanished, replaced by a desperate, intimate struggle for inches of ground. The battlefield shrank from the scale of divisions to the scale of squads, then fire teams, then individual men fighting with submachine guns, sharpened spades, and their bare hands in the suffocating darkness of a factory basement. The sound of the battle changed. The distant rumble of artillery was now punctuated by the sharp, close crack of a single rifle, the chatter of an MG-42 echoing in a stairwell, the muffled thump of a grenade in the room next door. The front line ceased to exist as a coherent concept. It was everywhere and nowhere. It could be the floorboards above your head or the wall behind your back. A building could be held by Germans on the first floor, Soviets on the second, and Germans again in the attic, each level a self-contained universe of terror. The soldiers of the Sixth Army, trained for a war of movement and encirclement, were now trapped in a claustrophobic hell they could not comprehend. Their tanks were useless, channeled into narrow, rubble-strewn streets where they were vulnerable to anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails dropped from shattered windows above. Their precise artillery was a blunt instrument, as likely to kill their own men as the enemy. Their superiority in air power meant little when the combatants were separated by a single brick wall. Here, the technological and tactical supremacy of the Wehrmacht dissolved. The fight became primal. It was a contest of endurance, stubbornness, and a willingness to absorb unimaginable losses. General Vasily Chukov, the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, famously declared, "There is no land for us beyond the Volga." His men fought with the ferocity of those defending their last inch of earth. They were welded to the ruins, becoming part of the city's tortured geology. For the German Landser, the experience was a descent into madness. The days blurred into a sleepless, nerve-shredding cycle of attack and counterattack. The smell of cordite, rotting bodies, and human waste became the very air they breathed. They fought for objectives that had lost all meaning: the Red Barricades, Ordnance Factory, the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, the grain elevator, the Pavlov's house. These were no longer just places, they were altars upon which thousands of lives were sacrificed, their names chanted like a litany of the damned. The city was a grinder, a machine of unparalleled efficiency for turning living men into dead meat. And as autumn deepened, the grinder did not slow. It only spun faster, pulling more and more men into its vortex, their individual hopes and fears rendered meaningless by the industrial scale of the slaughter. The city was eating the Sixth Army alive, one soldier at a time. As the German war machine bled itself white in the skeletal remains of the city, the vast, silent steppe that surrounded them was gathering its strength. While Paulus and his staff fixated on the last pockets of Soviet resistance along the Volga's western bank, a storm was brewing on their exposed and dangerously overstretched flanks. The flanks of the Sixth Army were not held by elite German divisions, but by their less equipped and less motivated allies, Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians. These were armies conscripted into a war they did not believe in, armed with second-rate anti-tank guns and spread thinly across hundreds of kilometers of flat, featureless terrain. They were the weak points, the soft underbelly of the German salient, and the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, saw it with chilling clarity. Under the direction of Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, the Red Army had been quietly amassing a colossal force, a strategic reserve of over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. They moved with masterful deception, under the cover of darkness and winter's first flurries, their build-up masked by the roar of the battle in the city itself. The plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was a classic of the military art, a massive, two-pronged pincer movement. One great armored fist would smash through the Romanian Third Army to the north of Stalingrad, while another would shatter the Romanian Fourth Army to the south. These two armored spearheads would then drive deep into the German rear, racing across the frozen steppe to meet at the town of Calacnadonu, on the bridge over the Don River, thereby encircling the entirety of the Sixth Army and parts of the Fourth Panzer Army. It was audacious, breathtaking in its scale, and almost completely unforeseen by a German command structure blinded by its own arrogance and its obsessive focus on the rubble of the city. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the storm broke. A deafening artillery barrage, a rolling thunder of thousands of guns, tore the dawn apart. The earth shook. For the Romanian soldiers huddled in their shallow trenches, it was the sound of the world ending. Out of the swirling snow and morning mist came the unstoppable tide, waves of Soviet infantry, their bayonets fixed, followed by the squat, formidable shapes of T-34 tanks. The Romanian lines, brittle and poorly equipped, did not bend, they shattered. Panic set in. Anti-tank guns proved useless against the T-34's sloped armor. Entire divisions dissolved into a terrified mob, fleeing westward into the snow. The news that reached the Sixth Army's headquarters in the village of Gumrak was confused, fragmentary, and deeply alarming. Paulus, ever the cautious staff officer, was paralyzed by indecision. He requested permission to withdraw, to pull his army out of the city and fight his way west before the trap closed. The response from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia was unequivocal: hold positions at all costs. Sixth Army is to form an all-round defense. The Führer could not, would not, countenance a retreat from the city that bore Stalin's name. For 4 agonizing days, as the Soviet pincers chewed through the miles, the Sixth Army remained largely static, continuing its futile attacks within the city, a giant oblivious to the mortal wound being inflicted upon its body. Then, on November 23, the trap snapped shut. Soviet tankers from the northern and southern fronts linked up at Kalach. The ring was closed. Over 250,000 men, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were now sealed in a vast pocket, a kessel, or cauldron, on the barren steppe. The hunter had become the hunted. The great predator was now caged, cut off from the world, with the infinite, hostile emptiness of the Russian winter closing in. The tide had not just turned, a tsunami had struck, and the Sixth Army was now adrift, alone, in a frozen sea. The first days of the encirclement were marked not by panic, but by a surreal, almost defiant, confidence. The men of the Sixth Army were, after all, the victors of countless battles. They were professionals. The word kessel, cauldron, did not yet inspire terror. In the previous winter, a similar pocket had been successfully supplied by air at Demyansk. This, they told themselves, would be the same. Their confidence was bolstered by a promise, a guarantee that came from the very highest echelons of the Reich. Hermann Göring, the bombastic head of the Luftwaffe, personally assured Hitler that his air force could supply the trapped army. He pledged to fly in a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day, the barest minimum calculated to keep the army fed and fighting. It was a lie born of arrogance and political cowardice, a fantasy that would condemn 250,000 men. The reality of the air bridge was a tragic farce from its inception. The Luftwaffe was exhausted, its transport fleet worn down by years of war. The distances were vast, and the Russian winter, the infamous General Winter, was beginning to assert its authority with blizzards and bone-cracking cold that grounded planes and froze engines. The 2 main airfields inside the pocket, Potomnik and later Gumrak, became islands of desperate hope in a sea of despair. Day after day, the soldiers would scan the gray, oppressive sky, listening for the drone of the Heinkel and Junkers transport planes. But the planes that arrived were too few. Instead of the promised 500 tons, the daily average was often less than 100. Sometimes, only a handful of aircraft would make it through the gauntlet of Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The supplies they brought were a pittance. A few loaves of bread to be divided among a company, a handful of ammunition clips, perhaps some medical supplies. The absurdity reached its peak when planes, having braved the perilous journey, were unloaded to reveal thousands of right-foot boots, or crates of pepper and margarine, or propaganda leaflets intended for a populace that no longer existed. For the men on the ground, this trickle of sustenance was a cruel joke. The daily ration was quickly cut, then cut again. A slice of bread, thin and frozen, a watery soup made from a horse slaughtered for its stringy meat. Hunger became the central, organizing principle of life in the Kessel. It was a constant, gnawing ache in the belly, a cold fire that consumed muscle and then fat, leaving men as walking skeletons draped in filthy, lice-ridden uniforms. The cold was its inseparable companion. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. There was no shelter on the open steppe, only shallow dugouts scraped into the frozen earth, where men huddled together for warmth, their breath turning to ice on the canvas ceilings. The Kessel was a closed system of decay. Nothing new came in, save for the inadequate trickle from the sky. Everything was consumed. Horses were the first to go, their carcasses stripped bare in minutes. Then came the dogs, the cats, the rats. The landscape was scoured for anything combustible, the wooden stocks of rifles, floorboards from shattered huts, anything to feed a pathetic fire that offered a few moments of illusory warmth. The initial confidence evaporated, replaced by a slow, creeping realization of their true predicament. They were not in a temporary pocket, they were in a tomb. The air bridge was not a lifeline, it was a thread, and it was fraying with each passing day. The radio brought them news of a relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, led by Field Marshal von Manstein. For a few days in mid-December, hope flickered as Manstein's panzers fought their way to within 30 miles of the pocket. The men in the Kessel could sometimes see the distant flashes of the guns on the horizon, a phantom promise of salvation. But Paulus, bound by Hitler's no retreat order and fearing he lacked the fuel to break out, refused to make the attempt. The relief force was stalled, then pushed back. The last light of hope was extinguished. Now, there was only the Kessel, the hunger, and the cold. If the city had been a meat grinder, the open steppe of the Kessel was a vast, cryogenic laboratory for the study of human suffering. The German soldier, who had arrived in Russia as a self-styled Superman, was now reduced to his most basic, shivering components. The true enemy was no longer the Red Army soldier, who was, at least, a recognizable foe of flesh and blood. The true antagonist was the environment itself, an elemental force of absolute and impartial cruelty. The cold was a living entity. It was not merely the absence of heat, it was an active, invasive presence. It found its way through the thickest wool greatcoats, through layers of newspaper stuffed inside boots, through the walls of the most carefully constructed dugouts. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the spirit, a constant, draining pressure that made every action, loading a rifle, digging a slit trench, even breathing, a monumental effort. The wind, the Buran, was its voice, a relentless, shrieking gale that swept across the plains, carrying with it a blinding curtain of fine, sharp snow. It erased landmarks, buried equipment, and froze sentries at their posts, turning them into ice-sheathed statues, their eyes open and staring into the white void. Frostbite became epidemic. It began as a numbness in the fingers and toes, a welcome relief from the pain of the cold, but it was a treacherous mercy. The flesh would turn waxy white, then black, as gangrene set in. Surgeons, working in unheated cellars with no anesthetic and unsterilized saws, performed hundreds of amputations a day, the crunch of bone echoing in the frozen air. Men would wake up to find that a hand or a foot, exposed from under a thin blanket during the night, had frozen solid. There was no escape from it. Metal became an enemy. To touch a gun barrel with a bare hand was to lose a layer of skin. Engines froze solid, lubricating oil turned to molasses. Tanks and trucks became inert iron monuments, their mechanical hearts stilled by the cold. Fuel turned to jelly. The once mighty panzer divisions were now little more than static pillboxes, their guns impotent, their crews slowly freezing to death inside their steel coffins. And with the cold and the hunger came disease. The lack of sanitation and the rampant lice infestations created the perfect breeding ground for typhus. The spotted fever spread like wildfire through the packed, filthy dugouts. It began with a headache and a high fever, followed by a rash and delirium. It stripped men of their last reserves of strength, leaving them to die in their own filth, their minds lost in fever dreams of warm homes and plentiful food. The medical system collapsed completely. There were no medicines, no bandages, no clean water. A simple wound, which in other circumstances would be trivial, became a death sentence as it inevitably became infected. The Kessel became a landscape of the dead and dying. Bodies could not be buried in the iron-hard ground. They were stacked like cordwood outside the dugouts, their limbs frozen into grotesque angles. They were used to supplement the walls of fortifications, their frozen forms providing a little extra cover from the wind and from bullets. The living grew numb to the sight, stepping over their dead comrades with a terrifying apathy. The struggle for survival erased all other considerations. Ideology, patriotism, discipline, these were luxuries that the cold had burned away. The only reality was the gnawing in the gut and the fire in the bones. The supermen of the master race had been humbled, brought low not by a superior army, but by the ancient, implacable power of the Russian winter. It was a force that did not negotiate, that felt no pity, and that was slowly, inexorably, freezing the life out of the Sixth Army. As the physical body of the Sixth Army was consumed by cold and starvation, its soul, the intricate structure of discipline, camaraderie, and military order, began to decay from within. The Wehrmacht, an organization built on a foundation of rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, started to fracture and then dissolve under the immense, dehumanizing pressure of the Kessel. The process was gradual at first, then terrifyingly swift. It began with the erosion of the officer corps. In the early stages of the encirclement, officers tried to maintain standards, to lead by example, to uphold the codes of conduct that defined them. But the great equalizers of hunger and typhus respected no rank. Officers grew as gaunt and lice-ridden as their men. Their authority, once absolute, began to seem hollow in a world where a crust of bread was more valuable than an iron cross. Some officers hoarded food, sequestering themselves in warmer bunkers while their men starved, shattering the sacred trust between leader and led. Others simply gave up, succumbing to a profound apathy, sitting and staring into space until they froze or starved. The bonds of the squad and the platoon, the small units that are the true heart of any army, disintegrated. The principle of sharing, of looking out for one's comrades, gave way to a desperate, animalistic individualism. A man's world shrank to the size of his own wretched body and its ravenous needs. Men stole food from their dying friends. They fought over a dropped cigarette butt. The weak were left behind, their pleas for help ignored by those who had just enough strength to save themselves. The campfires, once centers of fellowship, became tense, silent circles of suspicion, where each man guarded his pathetic ration with a murderous glare. This was the era of the Kessel prominens, the cauldron celebrities, men who, through luck, ruthlessness, or a hidden stash of food, managed to maintain a semblance of health. They were feared and hated, walking symbols of the brutal new social order. The very landscape of the Kessel became a map of this collapsed society. Certain areas, like the ruins around the main airfields or the cellars of command posts, were relatively rich, controlled by armed gangs of stragglers or rear-echelon troops who preyed on the weaker combat soldiers. To venture into these areas was to risk being stripped of one's last possessions, a coat, a pair of boots, a final photograph from home. Language itself broke down. The clipped, formal speech of the German military was replaced by a vocabulary of suffering, hunger, cult, laws, Tod, hunger, cold, lice, death. Men no longer spoke of strategy or victory, they spoke of bread. They dreamed of food, they hallucinated banquets, they scribbled fantastical recipes on scraps of paper. Their letters home, the ones they knew would likely never be sent, became desperate outpourings of this obsession, filled with pathetic, detailed descriptions of the meals they longed for. The facade of National Socialist ideology, so powerful in the summer of victory, cracked and fell away to reveal the terrified, bewildered human being beneath. The grand project of creating a new world order seemed like a lunatic's fantasy when compared to the immediate, overwhelming reality of a frozen toe or an empty stomach. The men felt abandoned, betrayed by the Führer who had promised them glory and delivered them to this frozen hell. Curses against Hitler became commonplace, muttered in the dark of the dugouts. The machine had broken. The gears of the Sixth Army, once so perfectly meshed, had ground to a halt and then rusted into immobility. It was no longer an army. It was 250,000 individuals engaged in a solitary struggle against death, a scattered collection of ghosts haunting a landscape of their own making. The collapse was not just military, it was civilizational. In the space of a few weeks, a century of German military tradition and a decade of Nazi indoctrination had been erased, scoured away by the fundamental, undeniable truths of the human condition in extremis. In the geography of despair that was the Kessel, the airfields of Potomac and Gumrack were the last, flickering beacons of hope. They were not just runways, they were portals, tenuous connections to a world of warmth, food, and safety. To get on a plane out of the cauldron was to be granted a resurrection, to be plucked from the grave. This desperate hope turned the airfields into the most chaotic and brutal corners of the pocket, magnets for every man who could still walk, crawl, or be dragged by a friend. The areas around the runways became vast, sprawling camps of the damned. Thousands of men, particularly the wounded, congregated there, lying in the open snow, waiting for a deliverance that would, for most, never come. The scene was a Boschian nightmare. The snow was trampled into a black, frozen slush, littered with discarded equipment, frozen corpses, and human waste. The air was filled with a constant, low moaning of the wounded and the dying, a sound that blended with the shriek of the wind and the sporadic crump of incoming Soviet artillery, which targeted the fields relentlessly. Official policy dictated that only the wounded could be evacuated. A Flugschein, a flight permit signed by a surgeon, was the most precious document in the world. A black market for these slips of paper flourished. They were traded for a lifetime's worth of savings, for wedding rings, for the last rations of bread. Forgeries were common. Men deliberately wounded themselves, a self-inflicted wound being a ticket out, though it often led to a fatal infection. The struggle to get to the planes was a Darwinian horror show. When the drone of an approaching transport was heard, a wave of humanity would surge toward the runway. Military police, the Feldgendarmerie, tried to maintain order, forming cordons and checking papers, but they were often overwhelmed. The strongest and most ruthless pushed their way through. Wounded men were trampled underfoot. Men clung to the wings and undercarriages of taxiing planes, only to be shaken off or to freeze to death in the upper atmosphere. The pilots, flying into this maelstrom, were saints or madmen. They landed their cumbersome Junkers and Heinkels on icy, cratered runways under constant shell fire. The process of loading was a frantic race against time. The wounded were thrown aboard like sacks of grain. Sometimes, able-bodied men would storm the planes, forcing their way on at gunpoint. The crews had to beat them back with pistols and fists to make room for the designated casualties. Every takeoff was a miracle. The overloaded planes struggled to gain purchase on the ice, their engines screaming in protest as they lumbered down the runway, Soviet shells chasing them into the sky. Many didn't make it, crashing on takeoff or being shot down moments after leaving the ground, their fiery demise a spectacle of extinguished hope for the thousands watching from below. In mid-January, Potomac fell to the advancing Red Army. The entire desperate mass of humanity migrated to the last remaining airfield, Gumrack. The chaos intensified, concentrated into an even smaller space. Gumrak was less a functioning airfield and more the final drain at the bottom of the basin. Then, on January 22, the last plane, a Heinkel He-111, took off from Gumrak. As it lifted into the gray sky, it severed the final, tenuous thread connecting the Sixth Army to the outside world. The Kessel was now hermetically sealed. For the tens of thousands still huddled around the silent runway, the departure of that last aircraft was a profound and final judgment. The portal was closed. The tomb was sealed. There was no more hope. There was no way out. There was only the end, waiting for them in the snow. The end did not come with a climactic, heroic last stand. It came with a slow, whimpering expiration. By the last week of January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. It had been shattered by a final Soviet offensive, Operation Ring, which carved the Kessel into smaller, isolated pockets of starving, frostbitten men with no ammunition, no food, and no will to fight. The surrender was a ragged, piecemeal affair, a final dissolution. The southern pocket, huddled in the basements and ruins of central Stalingrad, was the first to collapse. Here, in the cellar of the Univermag department store, was the headquarters of the commander, Friedrich Paulus. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Paulus was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal. It was not an honor, it was a command. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear, he was expected to commit suicide. But Paulus, a man broken by the weight of his responsibility and the scale of the disaster, chose to live. On the morning of January 31, a Soviet delegation entered his frozen, squalid headquarters. The newly minted field marshal, suffering from dysentery and a nervous tic that convulsed the side of his face, surrendered himself and his staff. There was no ceremony, no signing of formal documents in that moment, only the quiet, pathetic end to a monumental folly. When the news reached Hitler in his bunker, he flew into a rage, screaming in disbelief that a man could choose the shame of captivity over the honor of a soldier's death. He lamented that Paulus had stood at the threshold of immortality, and had chosen to turn back. But for the men in the Kessel, such notions of honor had long since become obscene jokes. In the northern pocket, resistance sputtered on for 2 more days under the command of General Karl Strecker. He and his remaining men were holed up in the ruins of the tractor factory, the scene of such bitter fighting months before. Their final radio message to the High Command was a piece of grim, Wagnerian propaganda. The Sixth Army, true to its oath and mindful of its lofty mission, has held its positions to the last man and the last round for Führer and Fatherland. Then, on February 2, Strecker, too, surrendered. And then, silence. After 5 months of ceaseless, deafening noise, the scream of Stukas, the thunder of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the cries of the wounded, a profound and unnatural quiet fell over the dead city. It was a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had ever been. The landscape that was revealed was apocalyptic. The city was a wilderness of rubble and ice, its jagged ruins poking through a deep blanket of snow. And everywhere, there were the dead. They lay in heaps in the cellars, they were stacked like firewood against the walls of buildings, they were scattered across the frozen Volga and the open steppe. An estimated 150,000 German soldiers had died in the Kessel itself. They were frozen into the positions in which they had fallen, their bodies preserved by the intense cold, their faces masks of agony or vacant surprise. Horses, also frozen solid, stood upright as if still alive. The whole scene was a vast, silent sculpture park of death. Out of the ruins and the dugouts, the survivors began to emerge. They were not soldiers. They were wraiths, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and frostbitten, blackened limbs, wrapped in rags. Of the more than 250,000 men originally trapped in the pocket, only around 91,000 were left to surrender. They stumbled out into the light, blinking like creatures who had lived underground for an eternity, and were herded into columns by their captors. The battle was over. The city bearing Stalin's name had held. The tide of the war on the Eastern Front had irrevocably turned. But for the men of the Sixth Army, the suffering was not over. The last letter from Stalingrad had been written not in ink, but in blood and ice, and its final postscript would be a death march into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Soviet prison camps. For the 91,000 men who surrendered, the end of the battle was merely the beginning of another, slower kind of death. Their ordeal was far from over, it had simply entered a new and more protracted phase. The Soviets, victorious but themselves exhausted and possessing meager resources, were completely unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners. There was little food, less medicine, and no compassion. The survivors of the Kessel were forced onto a final, agonizing journey, the death march to the POW camps. Already emaciated, riddled with disease, and enfeebled by the cold, they were made to walk for miles through the same snow-covered steppe that had been their prison. Men collapsed every few hundred yards. Those who fell were not helped, they were either shot by the guards or simply left to the mercy of the wolves and the cold. The roads leading away from Stalingrad became littered with a fresh trail of corpses, a final, grim punctuation mark on the catastrophe. The camps themselves were circles of hell. Places like Beketovka were little more than open-air pens or unheated, derelict buildings where thousands were crammed together in unimaginable squalor. Typhus, dysentery, and starvation ran rampant. The daily ration was a piece of black bread and a bowl of thin soup. The death rate was astronomical. In the first few months of captivity, tens of thousands perished. They died quietly, with the same apathy that had characterized the final days in the Kessel. They had used up their last reserves of will. Of the 91,000 who surrendered at Stalingrad, only around 5,000 would ever see Germany again. They would trickle back years later, in the 1950s, broken men, ghosts returning to a country they no longer recognized. Back in Germany, the Nazi regime performed a grotesque act of public relations. The destruction of the Sixth Army was not presented as a defeat, but as a heroic sacrifice. The state-controlled radio announced the news with somber, funereal music, declaring that the soldiers had fallen as martyrs for the nation. A period of national mourning was declared. But it was a lie. The men were not all dead, and their sacrifice had not been noble, it had been a needless and criminal waste orchestrated by the hubris of their own leader. The truth of Stalingrad could not be contained by propaganda. The last letters, the 39 mailbags filled with thousands of final, desperate messages discovered at the Potomac airfield, were confiscated by the regime. They were deemed too full of despair, too lacking in heroic spirit, to be delivered to the families. But the absence of letters, the silence from 250,000 sons, husbands, and fathers, told its own story. Stalingrad was more than a military defeat, it was a psychological turning point. For the German people, it was the first undeniable crack in the myth of Führer-willed victory. It was a wound in the national consciousness, a dark premonition of the Götterdämmerung to come. For the Soviet Union, it was a victory of almost religious significance. It was proof that the invader could be beaten, that the will of the people, when fused with the vastness of their land, was an unconquerable force. The ruined city became a shrine, a symbol of resilience and sacrifice that would galvanize the nation for the brutal, grinding war that still lay ahead. And what remains today? The snow still falls on the quiet steppe. The city, rebuilt and renamed Volgograd, is a modern, bustling metropolis. But the past is not gone. It lies just beneath the surface. The bones of the unburied are still found in the ravines and fields. The concrete husks of the grain elevator and Pavlov's house are preserved as monuments. The silence that fell in February 1943 echoes still. It is the silence of the last letter that was never sent. It is a testament to the abyss that opens when ideology eclipses humanity, when one man's obsession can condemn 1,000,000 to death, when the machinery of war is allowed to grind forward, heedless of the flesh and blood it consumes. It is not just a story from the past. It is a permanent warning, written in a frozen script, a final, somber message from the heart of the 20th century's darkness, whispering to us across the years, lest we ever forget the price of hubris, and the terrible, terrible cold.